Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Andrew Jones. I'm the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to Worldcraft, the business and culture of gaming in East Asia. This is a meeting which we hope will bring a lot of people of different types, people in the gaming industry, scholars of gaming, and developers together for an in-depth conversation. And as such, it's really the first of its kind here at Berkeley, and I think that makes it a tremendously exciting opportunity. It's also a conference which represents an extraordinary collaboration between a lot of different people and a lot of different units here on our campus at the University of California. So we've had the involvement in planning and making this a reality. The Centers for Chinese Studies, Center for Japanese Studies, and Center for Korean Studies. The Berkeley Center for New Media, which is housed just upstairs in this lovely Sujarta Dai Hall, one of the newest and I think most architecturally adventurous buildings on campus. And we also had the support of the Institute for East Asian Studies as well. I'd like to especially thank Charles Huang, who's sitting at the table and will be participating in our first panel, because the idea for the meeting was actually sparked in conversation between us originally, and I'm glad to see it finally borne fruit and become a reality today. Thanks also, as always, to Mary Chetak and to Eleanor Levine of the Center for Chinese Studies for doing all of the hard and grueling work of organizing the conference and making it come together so beautifully. It's quite interesting. Today, across campus, on the other side of campus, there's another big conference, a conference on early cinema and intermediality. That is the way in which early cinema emerged as a new form of media among other forms of media, including sound recording, painting, radio. I could go on, many others. And I've been running back and forth between the two meetings, and somehow I feel that there's an interesting polarity and some interesting parallels between the two. I don't think I need to convince any of you of the significance and the importance of gaming as a similar form of new media, which also invokes or is part of a kind of assemblage of different media that work together and create fascinating new convergences in our own time. But what I do hope that this meeting does achieve and is particularly exciting about it is it gives us a chance to look at the ways in which gaming as a kind of intermedial phenomena is transforming East Asia's social, cultural, political topographies, but also at the same time the way in which gaming itself is produced out of the topography of East Asia. And with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to our first moderator, Petrus Liu of Cornell University in comparative literature there, who's working on gaming as well as other things such as martial arts culture, which I think probably has a close connection to gaming in many ways. And Peter will guide us through the topographies of gaming in East Asia along with our wonderful panelists. So thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a pleasure.
Is the microphone working? Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Well, I want to thank Andrew for putting together this extraordinary event and inviting all of us here. This is really an amazing gathering, and I'm really excited about the conference. Even though we haven't started officially, I feel like this is the most fun I've had in weeks since reading last week. And I want to just introduce our speakers to you here. And our first speaker is Charles Huang, who probably requires the least amount of introductions, since we all know him or know of his work. He invented Guitar Hero, which got a lot of people addicted and ruined everybody's social life, or made a lot of people's social life possible. But what people might not know about him is that he graduated from Cal, so he's a Berkeley person. He majored in history, and actually, like a lot of us are, who also graduated from Berkeley. Our second speaker is Graham Candy, who is doing a PhD at the University of Toronto, and he's working on online gaming and the anthropology of technology under the supervision of Bart Simon.
That was my master's.
Oh, your master's, sorry. All right.
That's okay. Under Joshua Barker.
Under Joshua Barker. Okay, great. Okay. And our third speaker today is going to be Bonnie Nardi. She's in the Department of Informatics in the Donald Brin School of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. She works in activity theory, which proposes that consciousness is shaped by practice, that people and artifacts mediate our relation with reality. She's the author of many, many books and articles. The most recent publication is Acting with Technology, Activity and Interaction Design, which is from MIT Press, 2006.
I actually have a more recent book, but it's on my slides, so thanks for mentioning that one.
Well, feel free to, add to the introduction. She's also the co-editor of a special issue of computer-supported collaborative work. Thank you, on activity theory and practice of design, and another special issue on the structure of on the web, on the wind, the structure of invisible work. Let's welcome our speakers.
Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to come here. So as anybody who plays games knows, that in a lot of games you wage wars and battles against other players. But also the companies that make the games, they also wage battles in the marketplace against other companies. And I think in terms of the topography that Andrew was talking about, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the companies and the industries that are behind the gaming, the gaming sort of phenomenon in East Asia and beyond, globally as well. And I'm going to tell the story using a lot of numbers to sort of describe who the key players are and some of the numbers that to sort of quantify and qualify these companies. And then I'll layer sort of my own comparative perspectives of having been working in this field for 12 years of what some of these numbers may mean. So to begin with, I am going to start with the first set of numbers, which, so, in games, when you wage battles, you use weapons and sometimes magic spells to defeat other players. And in business, the weapons of choice happen to be stock and money. And so that's one quantitative measure of a lot of companies that are involved in gaming is taking a look at their market cap, which is how much the company is worth, and taking a look at their revenues. So in the first slide I put up here, let me use the slideshow, sorry. Oops, sorry. Yeah, all right. Oh, okay, sorry. There it is, sorry. Yeah. Publicly traded games companies by market cap. This was as of last year, November. All the numbers at the end are basically billions. So the biggest Tencent in China has a market cap of 40 billion. The company is worth $40 billion. What's interesting about this list, if you take a look at it, is of the top 5, you have basically a Chinese company is number 1, a Japanese company is number 2, a US company is number 3, a Korean company is number 4, and then you're back to another Chinese company is number 5. So the companies in East Asia, take 4 out of the top 5 slots in the world in terms of video game companies and how much they're worth. 10 years ago, this would not have been the case. 10 years ago, this would have been dominated by US companies and probably 1 or 2 Japanese companies. But clearly, you would not have seen a single Chinese or Korean company that probably was even in the top 10 10 years ago. And also, just by comparison, I put up at the bottom there DreamWorks Animation, which is one of the larger movie companies that are publicly traded in the world. And they have a market cap of about $2.4 billion. So DreamWorks, is the company that makes Shrek and like Monsters and Aliens and a bunch of those movies, very successful. And yet, if you look at what the company is worth, 2.4 billion, it would not even make the top 10 as far as what video game companies globally are worth. Now, another interesting part of this, I think, is part of what I'm talking about today is if you were to ask Tencent, for instance, who their biggest competitor is, they would probably tell you it's maybe NetEase or Shanda in China. If you were to go to Nintendo and ask them who their biggest competitor is, they would probably tell you today it's somebody like Sony, a Japanese company. If you go to Activision Blizzard, where I work, and ask them who the biggest competitor is, they would probably tell you Electronic Arts, an American company. So mostly, in terms of global gaming companies, there's been this détente where most of the battles they wage in the marketplace have been pretty much domestic. They stick to viewing their competitors as other companies that are largely in the same continent or country. In the case of Europe and the US, that tends to be largely one market. But I think over the next probably 3 to 5 years, maybe less, that's about to change. I think you will see this détente end, and you're going to see all of these companies basically begin to view each other as competitors, and the landscape of, I think, companies in East Asia that are involved in games is about to change because of that. So I'm going to show you the second slide of numbers, which is the publicly traded games companies, and this is a rank of them by revenue. The top 5 are ranked by revenue, and then I threw in some other ones that some people may have heard of. So what's interesting here is if you look at the top 5 here, they are all Japanese and US companies. And they're the ones that generate the most amount of revenue. So Nintendo leads the list at 14 billion. You have companies like Sega Sammy in Japan, which is at 4.8 billion. Activision is about $4.5 billion in revenue. So in terms of if you look at it in terms of the weapons that they have to wage this war against each other, in terms of stock and market capitalization, the East Asian companies are in the lead. In terms of actual money, revenues that they generate in cash, it's the US and the Japanese companies that are in the lead. So all this means, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's going to be a very even fight when it comes time for them all to take each other on. It'll be very interesting to see as they start throwing their weight around in both of these categories. So I'm going to jump now to a way to sort of break down what these opportunities are and what these companies will be fighting for. So to understand that, you have to understand a bit about the composition of the video game industry itself. So in here, which is a paper that was released earlier this year by a company called ThinkEquity, you'll see forecasts for the size of the worldwide video game market from 2009 to 2014. And obviously everything from 2010 on is estimates. But in this, you'll see that the largest segment of the games industry is in console games, which is largely dominated by the US and the Japanese companies. So Nintendo, Activision, Blizzard, Electronic Arts, that's where most of their revenues, and that's where they compete, is in the console space. The second and the third one is probably the one that's interesting to, third and the fourth, I should say, online subscription and online free-to-play. That's where most of the East Asian companies that are in Korea and China. So that is, the likes of Tencent, NetEase, Shandai Interactive. That's the area of the market where they compete. And then the last 3 there, where you see social games, mobile games, those are sort of new emerging platforms. So social games are the games that you play in Facebook. Typically, like Farmville is a social game. Mobile games are basically all the games that you play nowadays on an iPhone and Android phones. So like Angry Birds falls in the category of mobile games. What's interesting about these charts, if you look over time, at the last one, over there at the far, from your perspective, the far right, shows you the growth rates from 2010 to 2014. And the interesting part of those numbers is that if you look at where the biggest companies in the world currently compete, so the Activision Blizzards, the Electronic Arts, the Tencents, they happen to be at the top of the list. Console, PC, online subscription, online free-to-play. What's interesting about being at the top of the list is those are the slowest growing markets. And what's interesting about the bottom of the list is social games and mobile games are the fastest growing markets. You see in some cases in social games, they're predicted to grow over the course of those 5 years, 35% a year. And so this is where the conflict, and I think the détente begins to break down for all the gaming companies, is that the biggest companies in the world are competing in markets that are slowing. And what they're going to do is they're going to find their way to faster growth markets. And hence, when they get there, they're going to bump heads with each other. And I think that's where the détente that has existed over the past 10 years will eventually break down between the biggest gaming companies in the world. I'm going to scroll down this list to show you some more examples of why this might occur. This is Exhibit 2 up there is the total video game market, and it breaks them down by territory. So you see China, Europe, Japan, South Korea, the US. And you can see that China is one of the fastest growing. Again, at the end there is the sort of the annual growth rates. At 16%, one of the fastest growing markets in the world. But you can see by size that the biggest market is actually in the US and in Europe, followed by Japan. And then eventually over time, China begins to catch up to Japan. And South Korea is also a sizable market. So those companies that are in different areas. So for instance, the American companies where they're experiencing slower growth are going to move into China. The Chinese companies, as they begin to grow and bump up against the size of the market, will begin to move into where they see as the biggest markets. And the biggest markets in terms of the revenues are in the US and Europe. A couple of interesting phenomenons besides the total size of the revenue. If you look at Exhibit 3, I thought that was interesting, where in terms of virtual goods, already today the biggest market in the world for virtual goods is China. And that is one of the sort of the hottest areas where basically everybody that's in, not just gaming, but in sort of interactive entertainment, everybody that's in internet services and those mobile services companies are chasing after this sort of phenomenon of selling virtual goods. And China has the worldwide lead in terms of being a virtual goods market. You know, and then the other fast-growing area, Exhibit 4, there's social games. You can see that currently the Japanese and the Americans are in the lead in terms of the biggest social games markets, and those will be growing very fast. The US is actually a hotbed of social games. A lot of you probably played Farmville and other games made by a company in San Francisco called Zynga. And it's, you know, probably arguably in this recession, you know, sort of era of the last 2 or 3 years, that's probably been one of the biggest booms. Anybody who's knows students coming out of, say, computer science or animation knows that that field is probably one of the biggest net employers of technology, you know, of programmers, of engineers that's going in Silicon Valley today. So there's a huge boom in social games. Now, in terms of having seen this sort of the topography of where the markets are, how the markets differ by country, how the markets differ by technology platforms, I think I begin to see in the next couple of years some areas where I want to make, you know, just for fun, some predictions on where the first, you know, where the first bullets might fly in terms of the war between the largest video game companies in the world, and where you're likely to see the battles taking place. So, I think I'm going forward just 2 years. It might, you know, be 3. It might be 4. But I think in 2 years you're likely to see some things already change. The first one is I think you're going to see a couple of new combatants emerge that will establish themselves as top 5 gaming companies. And those two are Zynga and Nexon. So Zynga is the company in San Francisco, probably the largest social games company in the world. Farmville, Cityville. What else do they make? They make Yoville. Everything with a Ville after it is probably made by Zynga. And you may have played them on Facebook. And Nexon in Korea if you're not in Korea, you may not have heard of Nexon, but Cartrider is one of their most successful games. They're probably the most successful, or at least certainly one of the top 2 online game companies in Korea. And they are not yet public, and they will be going public, and they're probably one of the more aggressive games around. And so I think Zynga and Nexon will emerge in the next couple of years as a top 5 gaming company in the world. And both of them are very, very aggressive. And surely they will be, I think, instigating some of the video game wars. Now, I think by the year 2013, I think also you'll see some new emerging territories where the Chinese, the Korean, the US, and the Japanese companies will really wage their battles. And I think they'll wage their battles by racing to buy companies that are in territories like India, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe that do not have established giant companies. So, you know, we ourselves were one of the first, in fact, we were the first company, European or American company, to have established our own game development studio in India. And I can tell you today, India is not a big market for games. It's certainly not anywhere close to the numbers that you saw for the East Asian countries, but it is an emerging area along with Brazil and Southeast Asia. And I think all of those companies that are on the top 5 list, the Chinese, the Koreans, and the US, and the Japanese will be eyeing those markets for expansion. And I think in those territories, as they aspire to world conquest, they will bump heads with each other somewhere in India, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. And then the last part, I think, that will be interesting to watch and, again, change the topography of video games is battle of, I think, even true giants. So the technology platform wars, which are platforms, when I say a platform, you know, Facebook, an iPhone or iPad, or an Android phone, an Android pad. Those are, you know, in the case of Microsoft, probably like an Xbox 360 or Windows Mobile. Those are platforms that are run and owned by truly the biggest technology companies in the world. You know, that being Apple, Google, Microsoft, and probably soon Facebook and Tencent will join them as some of the biggest tech platform companies in the world. One of the things that happens, a lot of people may not realize about games in terms of their importance in establishing new platforms, is probably the most popular activity in terms of the amount of time people actually spend on all of these platforms is games. So early on, if you were in China and you went to any of the internet cafes at all, you saw that if you looked in there, most of the people, probably 70–80% of the people in there were playing games. And you know, the other 15–20% were in there checking emails or watching videos. And it's because games tends to take much longer than checking emails or watching a video. So when somebody goes in and plays a game, you know, they may spend 4, 5, 6 hours. In the case of a lot of those folks in China or South Korea, they'll spend easily 12 to 24 hours playing video games. There was a phenomenal stat that I saw once. The Chinese government surveyed gamers in China and asked them, what is your average play session? And a full 2% of the people responded the average play session for them was 24 or more hours. And anecdotally, I first thought that was kind of ridiculous until one time, a couple years ago, I went into an internet cafe in Shanghai. And I just went in there at 9 a.m. And looked around. And I literally saw at least 12 people sitting in front of the computers, sleeping like this, and with the game, you know, running on their screen. And it's clear they'd been there the whole night, and played through the whole night. And at 9 a.m., they were just sleeping in front of their terminals. So, you know, games, if you look at other platforms, Facebook, it's the same thing. If you look at the amount of time people actually spend on Facebook, the most amount of time is actually playing games. You can check your friends' feeds pretty fast. You can send a message to somebody fast. You can poke somebody, send them a birthday wish. You know, that only takes seconds. But the games themselves is what takes a long time to play on Facebook. And so the importance of games on Facebook is that they keep people on Facebook. Same thing with the iPhone. When the iPhone first launched, there was a stat I found that was very interesting in that they said about half of all downloads in the first couple of years of the iPhone were games. And about 80% of all paid apps were games. So it was clear, I think it's clear to a lot of technology companies that are building tech platforms that that what drives usage and adoption of their tech platforms is games. And so I think that's where their interest in going out and finding companies that can help them build their platforms, and in some cases owning those companies, will drive them to make billion-dollar plus acquisitions of gaming companies. So that a lot of those companies that you see up there, like the Electronic Arts, the Activision Blizzards, the NetEases, it's very conceivable that in a few years they cease to exist as independent companies and they get acquired by larger technology companies like Microsoft and Apple, Google, or Facebook. And so those are, I think, the ways in which the video game industry topography is likely to change in the next couple of years. And I think those of you who enjoy playing the games may enjoy watching the companies who, behind those games, engage in a lot of battles and warfare themselves. Thank you.
Is Mary here still? Do you have the link for the YouTube video?
It should be running in Internet Explorer.
It's an Internet Explorer. I just automatically loaded Mozilla by default. That's fine. Okay, thanks, Charles. That was a really good segue because whereas you're doing the economic topographies of gaming, I'm going to be doing the social topographies. I just wanted to say, Berkeley, I'm very disappointed in you. 24 hours ago, I was in Scotland, smugly packing my bags full of shorts, sunglasses, and even swimming goggles, telling my wife that I was going to go get a suntan. And I get here and they tell me it's going to snow. But yes, you're redeeming yourself. There's some sunshine outside, which is very nice. So down to business, or social business. And I'd like to begin my presentation by doing a very stereotypical anthropological thing and telling you a story, which we like doing. So this story begins, or the story takes place on December 26, 2006 in the city of Dalian in China, which is a northern port city, medium-sized population. And at the time I was studying at a local university and the fall semester was about to end. And I was packing my bags and I was getting ready to head down to South Africa where my partner at the time was working. And what we were doing at that time was using Skype pretty much every day to talk because it was a lot cheaper than the phone for sure. And so on December 26th, we're talking, I'm walking around the room, I'm packing up my stuff, and then Skype cuts out. And this wasn't terribly surprising because it happened all the time. And my partner used to go to this restaurant in South Africa that had free wireless, but very bad. So I wasn't terribly surprised when it cut out. And I assumed it was a problem on her side. So I waited around for a few minutes for her to reconnect to Skype, but she didn't seem to be coming back. And so I spent some time messaging my other friends on Skype, messing around, not packing. And after about 30 minutes, I decided she must have just given up and gone home. So I went to log on to Gmail to send an email to her saying, good night, I'll see you tomorrow, or I'll see you in 40 hours, or how long the flight was. And I couldn't log on to Gmail. And this wasn't terribly surprising in China at the time. My Gmail kind of went in and out, depending on how the internet censors felt that day, or if Google had pissed them off. So I tried Hotmail, which was my backup, and that never had any problems when I was there. And Hotmail was working, but it was so slow that it was just completely useless. So at this point, I started getting conspiracy theories in my head, like what's going on? Something crazy's happened. They've just blocked all foreign sites. So I go to Yahoo, doesn't work. So I'm like, confirmed. The internet, they've cut off everything. And so then I decided to go and visit a site that I know they'd have no interest in blocking, which was my Canadian Ice Hockey News website that I would go on and check. And sure enough, it didn't work either. So this was very confusing. So finally, I decided to log on to Baidu, which is the Chinese kind of equivalent of Google has news, and it's a portal website, and it loaded like that, fraction of a second, like normal. And I go to the news section to see if there's anything about what's going on. And it says, earthquake, internet severed. And I think, what the heck is going on? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? What the heck does an earthquake have to do with me not looking at the hockey scores in Canada? And I think the problem at the time was that I imagined the internet to be something composed of something like this. And this is a visualization popular visualization of about the 2,200 plus satellites that are orbiting the Earth, many of them dormant. When in fact, actually, the vast majority of data that is what we consider the internet has nothing whatsoever to do with these satellites. It actually has to do with this. And this is a 2009 submarine cable map of all the submarine cables running underneath the ocean around the world. And the vast majority of internet data moves through these cables. And the reason they move through these cables is they're cheaper, they're easier to lay down, they're easier to repair than satellites, and crucially, it actually takes a long time to send data up to a satellite and back, even at the speed of light, from a quarter of a second to a second. And that might not seem like a lot of time, but for time-crucial or time-sensitive business transactions, for using Skype, it just won't work. So I went to do some research on these submarine cables, and I came across an article written in 1996 by Neil Stephenson, who's a famous science fiction writer. And he wrote this article called Motherboard Mother Earth, which described the kind of the veins underneath the ocean that transport most human communication data these days. And he begins his story in the Malay Peninsula, looking at the rubber plantations that were used to harvest the rubber to encase the cables. And he ends in Cornwall, England, with the underwater sea surveyors that take boats around sending sonar signals down to the bottom of the ocean to look for the easiest paths for the submarine cables to lay down. And interestingly enough, the specific cable line that Stephenson was investigating was called the flag cable, which is short for fiber optic link around the globe cable. So the main flag cable up there is 28,000 kilometers long and about 1 inch in diameter. It was this cable, as well as one of its subsidiaries, the North Asia Loop, that was severed by the Hengchun earthquake on December 26, 2006, when I was talking to my partner on Skype. And the earthquake had struck 23 kilometers off the south coast of Taiwan. And while there was some medium-level damage in southern Taiwan, another type of damage had occurred at the bottom of the ocean, which was the snapping, the complete breaking of this cable. So while they sent emergency crews to repair the cable, which involves sending this big hook down and dredging it up, it's quite complicated, but easier to repair than satellites in any case. Pretty much all data transmission in and out of China just ground to a halt as the data was trying to be rerouted into these overland cables, which are much slower and had much, much less capacity. So one simple thing this event taught me, I guess, is that the terrestrial or underwater infrastructure of the internet is still terribly important to what we're doing day to day online. And it's this infrastructure and more generally the technologies, the material technologies of the internet, that is something that we as social scientists and people in general just tend to overlook. And I think that's understandable because for the most part it's in the background and you don't think about it. And players of online games, included, go about socializing, working, or playing, and carrying out a range of other productive acts in online games without thinking about this, the materiality of what they're doing. And it's only when something goes wrong, you lag, your server shuts down, that you begin to think about these issues. So the goal of this presentation is to shed some light on what the materiality of the net means for online social worlds. So I hope to give you a glimpse into the study of how the materiality of the net and the experience of online gaming can help explain the social topographies of play. and demonstrate some of the barriers and the pathways to the growth of social worlds in online spaces. So I'm going to be talking about a kind of old game, but still very popular. Yeah. Yes. So it's a classic, Counter-Strike, which was released way back in 1999, the ancient history of the gaming world. But it's still quite popular. In terms of gameplay, CS is a very simple design. It's one team of terrorists versus one team of counter-terrorists. You both start on opposite sides of the map generally, run towards one another, engage in combat, try to plant a bomb, try to defuse a bomb. Rounds could be as short as 10 seconds or maybe 3 or 4 minutes at the most. So I think it's important to give you an idea of what CS looks like for me to explain my arguments. So here is, quote, the best Counter-Strike match ever. I don't know if that's true, but you can see. And this is from a tournament, so you're going to see the players playing as well as what's happening on their screens.
Now alternate attack starting things off here in the beginning of the game, and Moon is able to get the first kill of the game. They're into Method. They're inside of that B side. They're trying to be able to clear out the site. Moon comes up big with that Glock headshot into Volcano, as now they're able to clear out the site. Rambo able to finally answer back here for 3D. Bomb has been planted inside of the bomb site. It's just going to be taken away here. Rambo looking to be able to get that second. Oh, it looks like Moon continues, and now it's going to be left up to Severs as he's going to have to be able to pull this one off. He's working through the back halls. Bomb sticking away here. See if he's going to be able to pull this one off. Again, to be able to move back around. Nice shots there coming in. He's able to take out one. Switches up his Glock. First fire, headshot. He's going to go straight for the defuse. The bomb ticking away, and that was a huge round. Oh no! Oh, very end of it. The bomb explodes, and it goes to alternate attacks. Comes down to the sliver of the defuse.
35 seconds for that bomb is how long you have, and it's ticking ever since it plants, and it just keeps going down and down and down. And Severs thought he had it. You saw him. He just got all excited. He thought, "Oh my gosh, I've got this round." And you know what? He didn't. He didn't win it. And guess what? Attacks is going to take the lead here, 1-0.
I love that clip. It's good. So I love that he yells, "You guys suck," right before the bomb blows up and kills him, and he loses the round. The combat in CS is similar and dissimilar to other kind of first-person shooting games. A lot of other games you can take kind of numerous shots before you die. You can heal, you get power-ups and these sorts of things. Whereas in CS, it can be extremely challenging for a new player. One bullet can end your round. You can sit there for the next few minutes, hitting your head against the desk while you wait for the game to play out. But as I said, the model's proved extremely popular. 12 years since the game's release, still has hundreds of thousands of regular players in North America and Europe. And overseas, it's proved equally successful. In China, CS is one of the staples of the online gaming market. And you can find someone playing it in pretty much every internet cafe. In late 2008, in China, a modified version of CS was put out by Nexon called Counter-Strike Online. And actually, Nexon's chief marketing officer will be giving a presentation tomorrow at the David Brower Center. So I'm very interested in listening to what he has to say about the features of this rapidly growing game market in China, which CS Online is one part. So what sorts of things are people doing when they're playing CS other than yelling at each other? As an online game, what's important for me is that they're playing with other people. Sometimes for a minute, sometimes 4 hours, sometimes for 24 hours if they're really gung-ho. Now they might know the people they're playing with, they might not. They might be friends they brought into the game. They might be people they've met in the game and become good friends with. Often it's a mixture of both of these. And it's these sorts of relationships that are really interesting to us as anthropologists. Anthropologists and other social scientists argue, that once people start getting together in these online spaces, that you see really interesting, productive activities occurring. Productive both in terms of economics, that there's people generating revenue, creating economies inside online games that have an impact in the real world, as well as being socially productive and producing social capital that players can draw on to enrich their own lives in all sorts of different ways. So I began really looking into social relations in CS a couple years after the earthquake off the coast of Taiwan. And when I was conducting research in the nature of trust in online spaces. And at the time I was playing with this idea that playing in CS is kind of like military context or high-stress business context, where you throw strangers into situations where they have to make very rapid decisions. And what was happening in CS, I argued, was that while strangers might play together once off and never talk to the other person ever again, or never get to know them in any way, it's the fact that strangers are thrown into collision in these stressful / fun situations over and over and over again because of the speed of this game. And what happens is in these situations, it constantly demonstrates whether you're selfish or selfless, whether you're collaborative or individualistic, you're calm or neurotic, highly skilled or average. So in this way, CS can be considered a kind of daily drama in which strangers are thrown into social collision in a way that a classroom or this room right now normally doesn't. So the simple proposition that arose from this earlier research then is that the speed of play is one of the drivers that brings people together in CS. And so the next question of interest became then, what is it that brings certain groups of people together? Why are certain groups of people coming together in particular servers as opposed to others? Now, we have decades of social science research about the interactions between strangers and how they're mediated by this whole host of linguistic and class and ethnic mediators. But you want to ask, is it the same when you get online? Is it just a duplication of these offline mediators happening on the internet? And so to answer this question, in CS we need, I think, to start at the beginning. And the beginning is, who can play together? Very simple question. Who can play this game together? And we do this by looking at the sites where the social relationships are born. And these are game servers. And game servers are just simply computers that are running the game in a continual basis, so that if you leave, you can come back the next day. The game server is still going to be there. It's going to have the same name, and you might bump into the same people if it happens. So understanding what brings players to one server over another, I believe, is crucial to telling us about the social topographies of online games. So I believe that, once again, speed is important here, looking at the element of speed. And so I'll begin by making a very simple proposition that most people play games, not all, but most people play games like CS, where there isn't this kind of, that's not important. Anyways, most people are playing CS or doing because it's fun in some sense. It's really simple, they enjoy it. So the question becomes, what are people judging their fun by? And understanding what impacts on people doing better or worse in a game is very important, understanding who plays it and why they're playing it. So I suggest that one of the simplest ways to do this is to look at the sorts of information, the sorts of feedback that players are given in game. So here's a screenshot from CS that I just found on the internet the other day. I wanted to get a new one. I think it's new. Anyways, so you can see here, when you press the tab key in CS, you get this. It's very simple. It's your scoreboard. It tells you the names of all the players, if they're dead or alive, their score, and their death, and their latency. And so you can see here, number 1 is no such CVAR. We've got some other people in here. Satan, apparently, is playing. And the knight who says ni as well. So there's a Monty Python fan in there. Number 1 here, you can see the guy who put the screenshot on the internet, because he's probably proud of himself, is no such CVAR, is 43 kills and 9 deaths. So there's that one other column, though, latency. And I begin to ask, why is it that latency is put up as one of the very little information that you're given in CS? And latency refers to the amount of time it takes for data to get sent from your computer. So when you click your mouse, the amount of time it gets sent from your computer to the game server and back to your computer. And it's measured in milliseconds. So no such CVAR has a ping of 33 milliseconds. That's 1/33 of a second was the amount of time that it took for his data to get sent back and forth. And the highest ping is Secure Ops Leaves, who has 133 millisecond ping, which is 1/10, a little over 1/10 of a second. So these are very minute periods of time that pass very quickly. And for most of human experience, these brief periods of time have no meaning, really, in our lives. They pass so quickly. But what does it mean in online gaming environments? Why is it there? So this is data from the early 2000s, taken from Quake, actually, and which is a bit of an older game and kind of passed on. But and it maps out median ping against frags per minute. And the guy did it by setting up a server in Palo Alto and one in London, so you could get a kind of a nice spectrum of users, and then mapped, their ping against their kills. So although the pings here are much higher than you experience these days because the net wasn't quite so well developed, even if you take the chunk that we're dealing with, which is 0 to about 150, there's still a very significant difference over time. A person with 50 ping, 50 milliseconds, and a person with 150 can get as little as 22 fewer kills in this graph over 30 minutes, which is a very significant qualitative difference in your experience of play. And more so than just getting kills and running around and whatnot. There's also a whole set of other social acts in games that depend very crucially on speed, on being able to react very quickly, and this involves things like throwing grenades, or someone comes around the corner twitching your hand, or in competitive play, carrying out very detailed strategies like we saw them trying to do in that video. So now, these are the sorts of practices I say that are dependent on milliseconds that build the sort of trust that I was talking about earlier. And I think fundamentally underpins the whole social topography of games like CS. So let's take an example. So I have my first example is from the Great White North, and that's Canada, called the New Brunswick CS Server. And it was started in 2004, and it takes its name from the province where its founding members are from. The server itself, however, is rented out of Toronto, where there's a much bigger market for server rentals. And some people play casually, some people have been playing there for 5 or 6 years and have met really good friends online and developed relationships that have carried over into their offline life. So here's a map of North America, and the server is Toronto. Where is Toronto? Here? Is Toronto? Is that right? I think so. So if you were to imagine what the distribution of players, literally social topography of players would be in North America, you might start by looking at the macro situation. And North America has very decently well-developed internet infrastructure. It has relatively low-cost access to the net, and there's almost no language barrier, at least in the United States and Canada, for the vast majority of players. So you might imagine that the map would stretch across North America, and you'd have people in California playing with people in Toronto. So what happens, if we spend a bit of time mapping out the distribution of players across this map of North America, we actually find something much different. So what I've done, and you'll see in a second, is I've taken the IP addresses of 100 players on this server that have over 1,000 connections, and I'm speculating that these people are the people that are most likely to be involved in the kind of social relationships that we're interested in exploring as anthropologists. And mapped it onto this image of North America. And forgive me, this is with paint, my wonderful lack of skills. And what it actually looks like is something like this. And what we see here is that the 100 players are actually, for the most part, clustered around a very limited geographic area in North America. And while the US-Canada border, as you might predict, has become somewhat irrelevant in who's playing on this server, the topography of play is still highly circumscribed. So to emphasize this, we can see only 4 players out of 100 here come from outside of North America. And those are the 4 red marks flying off towards Europe, where those 4 people connected from. And in fact, it's even more limited than that, with the vast majority of players playing in the Northeast. What this social topography is fundamentally circumscribed by, then, I argue, as I've mapped here, is by ping. And players with a ping of under 50 milliseconds, 1/20th of a second, make up 85%, make up 85 out of 100 of these players. So the way I like to describe it is essentially that individual servers are kind of material social gravity wells that pull people in within that infrastructural network. And what we see then is this map of North America being reimagined or redrawn in a way that makes network fidelity the basis for social fidelity. So to give you another perspective of how speed and network infrastructure shapes social topographies, this is a map built out of Hangzhou in China. And the way I've done this map is instead of getting the IPs of an individual server and mapping them out, I've taken what a player connecting from Hangzhou would see as their options for server connectivity. And it's this one client called the Huang client. There's many different clients that people use in China to connect to CS. And as you can see here, the list of servers actually only included these provinces. There was no option to connect outside of what's considered China in this server. And I don't think it was a particularly political decision. I think it was a practical business decision in terms of getting people to play on your servers, using your client, and keeping them in the system so that if they're going to play other games, they're going to use your client in your system. So, so you can see here that obviously where Hangzhou is in Zhejiang province is green, and the surrounding provinces for the most part have a very good ping, and then it kind of fades to yellow and then red. So interestingly too, there's also some black spots where there's nothing. There's no option for a server to connect in that area, and that's in Inner Mongolia, Tibet, and Jiangxi province, I think. And what this does, in a sense, is it doesn't stop people from playing who are from there. It just doesn't mean they don't have a server specifically named after their own region. So in a sense, if they are using this particular client, it will scatter them to a certain extent into nearby other provinces to play. So and I think this combination of geographic restriction, server location, and ping has a really interesting possible social impact when we consider the presence of, let's say, the server in Taiwan. And Taiwan's there's a game server, everyone can connect to it, and it has a really good ping for people who are playing from Hangzhou. So no doubt people are playing on this server. And the ability for people to play on this server, I think, it opens up the possibility for exactly what we describe as anthropologists in online worlds, which is new collaborative social relations with people, with strangers, that they may never have the opportunity to meet in their daily lives due to a number of circumstances. And I think this new material social effect that situates Chinese CS in other games as a new way of interacting with otherwise socially, politically restricted others is something that is opening up these really dynamic new pathways. And I'm really happy because tomorrow, Ho Lin, if I pronounced the name wrong, is actually giving a speech on just that topic about Chinese gamers and Taiwanese gamers playing together on servers. So I think they're going to do a much better justice than I could. And I haven't done the detailed ethnographic research for that, and I'm really interested in what they have to say. So in conclusion, I think there's 4 things I've argued are important for understanding the social topographies of online worlds. And first, simply, is that materiality matters. And it's something it's far too easy to ignore when you're looking at social life. And the software, hardware, infrastructure, they come to intersect in a way that I think we can argue that for some games, and this applies to World of Warcraft in interesting ways as well, in terms of server location. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff online about Australian gamers fighting for servers in Australia because they're forced to play World of Warcraft in a way that, although the pings are much more tolerable, you can play up to 300 milliseconds. Once you get into high-level World of Warcraft, it becomes completely unacceptable. And there's actually formed a kind of Australian diaspora in World of Warcraft, where Australian players have huddled together on certain North American servers based on the West Coast and kind of pushed everyone else out and made these Australian communities in online worlds. Anyways, sorry, I've gone off topic now. So what I'm arguing then is network fidelity and social fidelity are intrinsically entwined online. And the way this becomes reflected in social topographies in terms of CS is that what happens is that social topographies orbit the gravity wells of particular servers and server nodes and other material constructs. And while in this way games like CS show the tensions between the kind of globalizing power of online worlds and the provincial nature of social reality in the 21st century. So while greatly expanding the literal geographic scope of social relations, the logic games still remain bound to specific intersections of infrastructure, server clients, the logic of individual games like CS, and individual choice, of course. So I hope this talk has demonstrated that the sustained exploration of this material social intersection is really needed as part of our academic toolkit we use to explain the social topographies of interaction. I think topographies that will help us understand all these new and dynamic strands of human interaction as they continue to pop up in new places. So thanks.
Okay, so I would like to bring culture into this discussion. We've talked about economics and we talked about the social aspects, and I want to talk now about culture. I'm an anthropologist, so I've been doing this a long time, and it is really hard to talk about culture. We don't know exactly what it is, and as soon as we start talking about it, we begin to invoke entities like nation states and economies and politics and history and institutions, and suddenly things become extremely complex and extremely complicated. And how do we deal with some of this complexity? And how do we avoid some of the problems that come with talking about culture? My remarks are going to be made in the context of research on World of Warcraft that I've been doing for almost 5 years. So I think most of you know that WoW is a very popular multiplayer online video game. There are 12 million players worldwide. It's available in 9 languages, which makes it a really nice object of cultural analysis. WoW is a role-playing game. It has a medieval theme. So when you log in, you create characters and you slay monsters and you perform medieval crafts and you do trading in an auction house and those kinds of things. A picture just came up over my slides. I guess it's okay. It's very social, so most players join guilds, which are like clubs. You have people that you get to know, that you socialize with and play with when you log on. WoW is produced by Blizzard Entertainment, which is in Irvine, California. And my research was participant observation in games, so I spent a lot of time playing the game. I started playing in late 2005. And a lot of reading of related text, so there are lots and lots of blogs and wikis and facts and forums and so on about World of Warcraft. When I first started studying it, I thought I was just going to get to play the game, and then I suddenly realized that the game goes way beyond its own boundaries in-game. I'm going to be talking about player-created mods. So mods are small software modules that players create themselves and put up on websites for download, and they're for customizing the game. So if you're a devoted player, you might have an idea about something you'd like to do a little bit differently in the game, and Blizzard has made it possible for people to write mods and make them available. And I'll be talking about modding in China and the US. I saw pretty similar things in both places. I got started studying World of Warcraft here in North America, mostly because yeah, you're laughing at the internet cafes. I spent many hours in there. Mostly because I heard the undergraduate students talking so much about World of Warcraft. And since I study social life on the internet, I thought I really should take a little peek at this, even though I'm a very atypical gamer. So I thought I would just kind of sneak in there and find out a little bit about what all these people were so excited about. But then I got very caught up in the game, and I've spent a lot of time studying it. And I felt like I should really do some cross-cultural research, partly because I'm an anthropologist, but partly also because about half of all WoW players are Chinese. And although there's a lot of work on World of Warcraft, most of it comes from North America, a little bit from Europe as well. But it tends to be pretty culturally biased. And because we've done a lot of work, we're now making statements, well, World of Warcraft is this and World of Warcraft is that. And I wanted to see if this was really true, if we could really generalize from what we were seeing in North America and to a lesser extent in Europe. I did not study gold farmers. As soon as I say WoW in China, everybody always assumes that I went to study the gold farmers. And it's a fascinating topic, but the vast, vast, vast majority of players of World of Warcraft are not farming gold. They're playing just like any ordinary player, and that's what I wanted to study. So I did 40 interviews while I was in China, and many, many hours of observations in internet cafes and also in dorms and homes. These are the places where people typically play games in China. Now I have another data set as well from my student, Yang-Ming Cao. Yang-Ming is from Singapore, but he speaks Chinese natively. So it was kind of interesting for him to go to China, and he did a big study of the modders in China and what it's like to be a modder in that context. So he did a lot of interviewing. He also spent a lot of time in Chinese chat rooms. Okay, so culture is very fraught. As I said, as soon as we start trying to talk about culture, and I noticed that Graham did not use the word, even though he's an anthropologist. So, you know, it is very difficult. And sometimes it's like, well, we just want to throw that out because we don't really know what we're talking about. The first thing I think we need to do with cultural analysis is not use it as a kind of catch-all causal mechanism. I see this a lot. I participate in the human-computer interaction and computer-supported collaborative work communities, and I review a lot of papers, and as people do try to get out of the North American and European context and go elsewhere, they do cross-cultural research, but often there are these very simplistic analyses where culture is the cause of whatever it is that they're studying. And I think we need to be very careful not to do that. On the other hand, we don't want to ignore culture. We all know as human beings that it's there. We all have our own cultures. We all know how to behave in our own cultures and not behave in other cultures. As soon as you set foot off the plane, you know you're in another culture. So what is that all about, and how do we bring that into our analyses? I think it's important to look at similarities as well as differences. As soon as you go to another culture, I'm sure that you have gotten this, people always want to know what's different about it. No one has ever asked me what is the same in China about playing WoW, whereas many, many people have asked me what's different about it over there. I was really glad to hear Graham talk so much about materiality. I think we want to be very careful to take into account our artifacts, our socio-material resources, very, very important in trying to understand culture. And then I'll talk a little bit about grounded comparison, which is a simple technique for trying to deal with cultural analysis. Okay, so I'm going to use my own data to go through these 5 steps, these 5 things we can do, I think, to have better cultural analyses. So the first one, not using culture as a simple causal mechanism. The problem here is that we tend to very quickly slip into ethnocentrism, into us versus them, into Orientalism, into constructing an other, and usually that's not a very productive thing to do when we're trying to understand cultures. So Yang-Ming Cao and I were studying modding, and we wanted to compare the number of mods created in China versus the US. Very simple kind of quantitative analysis. And so we went on to the 2 major sites, download sites in China, and the 2 major download sites in the US in April of 2009. And here's what we found. So basically we found there are more than twice as many mods being created in the United States as in China. And this is a little bit surprising since there's more than twice as many players in China. And we wanted to understand why that was. Now, I think what springs to mind when you don't really think about it too much is, well, Americans are inventive. You know, the people in the Orient, they tend to copy us. That's what they're good at. We're good at coming up with our own new ideas. But as we tried to look at what was really going on in the modding communities in China, we found, for example, that there are no Blizzard-sponsored forums for Chinese modders. So here Blizzard has these really wonderful, dynamic, vibrant forums where not only modders go, but Blizzard employees occasionally comment or answer questions. And this is very exciting for the modders, and it gives them really important information that makes modding, creating these software modifications, a lot easier. Because WoW is run by NetEase in China, there's a break there's a disconnect between modders and the mothership, Blizzard, in Southern California. So many of the resources that come through these official forums are not available to Chinese players. We didn't find any programming manuals. We didn't find any programming frameworks. These are resources that American modders have. Like if you look down in the bottom corner there, really nice book on how to program World of Warcraft, published by a mainstream publisher, Wiley. Really important resource for the community. So a simple cultural explanation would be, well, of course, Americans are more resourceful. We put our resources together, and we know how to get things done. But if you look at the history of the internet as well as modding in China, it's so much newer there. So we can look back to 1961 as the beginning of modding in the US. There's an old game called Space War that allowed for simple modifications, and that was kind of the beginning, and it has come up to the present time. Now, as far as we can tell, World of Warcraft is actually the first game in China that allowed any kind of modding at all. There was certainly hacking in China, but things change when you go from illegitimate to legitimate. So this is a big difference between modding here and modding in China. The reward structure is also very different. So here, if you produce some mods that are pretty popular, and of course you can tell how popular they are because the download counts are right on the sites, you're getting good feedback from your users. This can be something you can put on a resume, in particular if you're applying to a gaming company. If you're applying to a really straight-laced company, you might not want to mention World of Warcraft, but if you're going for a gaming or a media kind of job, then this looks really good. So even though most modders don't start out thinking in these instrumental kinds of ways, as they become more part of the community, they see that there might be something instrumental about what they are doing. Not true in China, so you would never really be able to use this on your resume. It wouldn't help you at all. Different reward structure. In the United States, in North America, players give you feedback on your mods, and sometimes they complain, but oftentimes if they like your mod, they let you know. And this is very, very rewarding for modders. You know, they basically are there for the recognition because they're not really making any money. Almost none of them are making any money. So this is really exciting. The Chinese modders, though, don't get this kind of feedback. It's not quite yet part of the practice of players. They just download the mods and use them. And so the Chinese modders feel a little bit isolated. They don't have that sense, somebody's using my mods and really enjoys them. And again, this is not so cultural, I think, as simply because of the newness of the internet in China and internet communities, online communities. So once we dig beneath the surface and start looking at economic and historical and governmental factors, things look very different, and these simple kinds of cultural explanations really don't work out. Now, on the other hand, we don't want to ignore culture. As I said, we all know that it is there. So when Yang Mingkao and I looked at the data from the chat rooms that the modders gathered in China, we found this very interesting culture of teaching and learning, which is, we would argue, definitely part of Chinese culture going back literally thousands of years. And here are some of the things that we found that led us to believe that. The more experienced modders were given honorific titles like Da, or Big Brother, or Boss. Never happens, at least we didn't see it in any of the chat rooms that Yang Ming sat in on in North America. Many of the more experienced modders referred to the less experienced as their students. The word learning came up a lot in the discourse. We logged a lot of discourse and analyzed it. Learning new things feels good. I will return to learn this shortly. Appreciate your effort. You nag like a teacher. So this notion of teachers and students and learning was very much a part of how the chat rooms were structured. The more experienced modders had to also act as disciplinarians. So we have kind of a culture of netiquette here that we've developed over the years, over the decades. Again, because this is so new in China, we don't really quite have that there. And many people come into the chat rooms and just kind of goof around. There's a Chinese expression, pouring water, which means you're not really on task. You're not doing what's supposed to happen in whatever the context is that you are in. And so the more experienced modders have to squelch the pouring of water in the chat rooms. On the other hand, getting back to the culture of learning, they established that it was okay to submerge in water, another Chinese expression, meaning in this context, just to read the chat. And I like this very much. You know, we have this notion of lurkers, which is kind of sinister and negative. And in China, they have a much more positive spin on, well, I'm just there, I'm reading, I'm learning, I'm imbibing, I'm submerging in water and getting something out of this experience. So they encouraged people, the teachers encouraged people to do that. Okay, I talked a little bit about looking for similarity as well as difference. This is pretty obvious, but again, lots of pressure to talk about what is different. So one of my big findings from spending this time in China in 2007 was that World of Warcraft is pretty similar in China compared to the US. So when people talked in the interviews that we did about World of Warcraft and school and work, it was the same kind of, I really love this game, it's creative, it's fun, it's challenging, whereas school and work tend to be kind of boring and stultifying and very restrictive. So this kind of comparison came out in both cultures. People played with friends and spouses, very social, as Graham was talking about. They played very long hours. I actually didn't see anyone playing 24 hours, but definitely very, very long hours. It's really easy to sit down and play for 8 hours and not even notice that the time has gone by. People in both countries mentioned that they liked the diverse game activities. So WoW is this big world. It's very different than Farmville and these smaller games. There's so many different things to do, and people noted that they really liked that. They liked the challenge, they liked the graphics, lots and lots of comments about the graphics in both places. So really there's quite a bit of similarity. And now I'm going to just underscore what Graham has been talking about. Don't underestimate the power of artifacts. Material culture is very important. We tend to overlook it. In particular in anthropology, I think the younger generation is changing this, but typically we look at the social, we're at these very high kind of ethereal, abstract levels, and we forget about the cultures, the material cultures that are sustaining our social interactions. And I just mentioned these things again as being similar on this slide to say that I think that in large part they can be attributed, these similarities, to the power of the software artifact, to the directive power of the software artifact to engage in interest and inform and challenge and direct the activity of the human player. I don't think these similarities that we're seeing between very, very different places are accidental. I think much of it comes from the software artifact itself. Okay, so a simple technique to try to do better cultural analysis is what I call grounded comparison. And this is organized around dualities. So looking for similarities and differences at once, and looking for connections as well as disconnections. So a lot of what we do in social science now is looking at connections across various kinds of boundaries. So a lot of transnational analysis, and I'm definitely all in favor of that. That's all to the good. But I think sometimes we forget that there are also disconnects that can be very important. And the one that I talked about today was the disconnect between Blizzard and the Chinese modders, who are in a very different situation than the North American modders because they don't have the forums, because they don't have the feedback from Blizzard. They're kind of out there on their own. So trying to look at connections and disconnections at the same time. I think grounded comparison can be really helpful for critically examining concepts that are supposedly universal. This is again why I believe cultural analysis really is something that we absolutely have to have. So if you look at something like Web 2.0, it's about sharing and meritocracy and collaboration and community, and we tend in North America, and I think in Europe too, to kind of assume that these are universal goods and that everybody's going to agree that this is how it should be and that the internet is bringing us these wonderful things. So you look at a site like Wikipedia, which I think really embodies these kinds of Web 2.0 values. Anybody can sign up and make a contribution. If you do make a contribution, as long as you adhere to group norms, you can be promoted within Wikipedia. You can rise up through the ranks. Basically, the community is composed of virtual identities. You know people virtually, so you keep in touch through media like email and wikis. But when we looked at WoW modding communities, we saw something quite different. And again, this is Yang Kao's research going to the 6 Chinese cities all across China to knock on doors and find modders to talk to. And in fact, what he found was that the modding work groups, as we're calling them now, are not communities in the Web 2.0 sense. They're composed of core teams. So on a core team, people often know each other in real life. They often have a charismatic leader who recruits members. So in the picture there, you see Shining Gan, who's one of these charismatic leaders. Very small and tight-knit groups, bonds of friendship and respect are the basis of the work group, of the core team. People tend to keep in touch through instant messaging and phone as well as through email. And these core teams are also an aspect of Chinese business practice. So before we expand Web 2.0 to kind of encompass the entire world, we want to look, I think, empirically at what it's like to do work in different kinds of internet communities in different cultures. Okay, so I hope that these 5 steps will help us avoid hegemonic references to culture in which we usually end up looking better than them, and history and economy and governance and global institutions like corporations and governments tend to fall out of the analysis, missing the important complexity that we're trying to understand. So here's my most recent book, and I discuss some of these issues in the book, and also there's an article just coming out in Interactions magazine on comparative informatics that discusses grounded comparison. Okay, thank you. I was trying to close it, but
We'll just leave it. All right, we have quite some time here for discussion and comments, and I have some questions, but first I'd like to hear if the speakers would like to comment on each other's papers, or if anybody in the audience would has any questions for the speakers.
I want to reinforce what Bonnie was saying about and I didn't cover that we're both talking about materiality, but I was very much talking about the materiality of the cables and the infrastructure and servers and server nodes but yeah, the software, the actual coded pathways are incredibly important in helping to explain the sorts of relationships as well. And I don't know if I emphasized it enough, but when I was showing that screenshot of the scores, that's the HUD, the overhead display, and I mean, to me, I think having the ability, to see your ping, for example, completely changes your conception of what it means to play, and it gives you a comparative point against all other players. When we do social analysis, it's always going to be this really complex web.
It's very complex. Yeah.
And this is just the materiality. It's layered in so many ways, from the mouse down to the internet cables, and that's obviously going to be one of the big challenges of doing anthropology and digital anthropology or anthropology of technology, is that we have this huge basis of social research we can do on what's happening in these communities, and then we have this whole other layer that we have to merge with it. So.
Yeah, and I think the spaces are important too. Like the Internet Cafe is a very particular kind of space for playing World of Warcraft, which is different than playing in your home.
Absolutely, and same thing with online first-person shooter games as well. Playing in your home is a completely different experience than playing at the Internet Cafe. And the Internet Cafes never really took off in North America. It was such a brief period of time where they kind of popped up, and then they faded very rapidly as PCs became kind of readily purchasable. And that's even going to be more challenging, I think, and not many people do research on it, but console games, where there's a huge amount of online play has become a huge component of console games. And as you were saying with Blizzard, in terms of not being active, they license it out, right? In China, they license it out. Yeah. It's really important to look at also what the developers are doing in terms of how they're shifting people in certain directions, or giving people more options or not. In terms of console games, a lot of the times you can't run your own servers. The servers are just a list that you have to choose from, given by the company that's operating the game, or Microsoft, or so on and whatnot. So it totally changes the pathways in terms of who's playing with one another. And maybe when you're looking at console games, you see more of a shift towards people bringing their offline relationships into the online games, and bringing people they already know and who they're familiar with in the home play environment, and bringing them into online gaming world, and moving away from necessarily engaging with strangers. But so.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions for you. Can you
Oh, sure. Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I was curious with the modders, first of all, could you talk about, did you find any female modders? Like, I'm sure it's not as simple as they just weren't interested. You know, did you see participation, or were there structures that, you know, kind of worked against it, like I see with like fighting game communities? And the second question relates to, I know WoW is, you know, different in China. You know, it's been modified itself so that it can be in the country. And I was wondering if you have any sense of structural differences in the game itself that impact then the player's own modifications to the game.
You want me to take the gender question first? Yeah, we only found 1 female modder in North America. Now, we didn't do a big, huge survey, but a lot of modders live in California, and we actually met with them face-to-face when we went to one of the BlizzCons. There was another woman who's an administrator and kind of a facilitator in the community, and everybody else was a guy. Oh, I should have showed you they really nerdy-looking guys, so wonderfully, you know, characteristic. And in China, we didn't find any female modders at all. And I expect there are probably, you know, a few somewhere, but, you know, Yang was just there for the one spring. So it tends to be very much a male kind of activity. And, you know, it's a really good question. I do not know why, because it's not that there aren't any structures in place. Typically when people start modding, they just say, why doesn't the game do this? I can program enough that I think I could make it do that. And girls and women seem not to do that, and guys do. And, you know, it goes back to old issues of identity, I think, and feeling empowered technically. But it's a great question for research.
Yeah, there's Tanya Stevenin did her dissertation on female modders in The Sims, because it's not really thought about as much as modding, right? But you know, the skinning and the designing of artifacts and things, and there's a, you know, huge player community around it. Maybe it's even just because it's thought of differently, but there were a lot of women active in that space.
Yeah, I need to read that. Yeah, that's a really good pointer. And then the other question, actually, at the time I was in China, World of Warcraft looked very, very, very much like it does here. You know, they took out the skeletons because this was another thing of the government feeling that they didn't like the pictures of the skeletons in the game. And when I went, it had just happened that they had yanked the skeletons out. And that's one reason you have a company like NetEase, so they can control those kinds of things. And I asked players, I said, well, does this have significance in Chinese culture that it's bad to show skeletons? And they said, no, not in particular. And the players I spoke to felt that it was just a move on the part of the government to show their strength, to show that they were monitoring, to show that they were watching, to show that even though people were playing this Western game, they had their eye, and that was how they saw it. I was actually surprised that they would say that to me, but they were pretty open about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'm pretty loud. I can just talk. Oh, yeah. Recording.
Thanks.
I was just going to comment on what you said, Bonnie, just now, because I was reading, it was either PC Gamer or GamePro, I'm not sure which one it was, and they had this great big article on the differences between World of Warcraft here and in China, and let's look at what the orc looks like in China, and it had a picture of the orc here covered in skeletons and skulls and things, and then a picture of the orc from China, and all the skeletons weren't there. And the gist of the article was what you were talking about. It was basically an Orientalist article saying in China they believe, you know, the Buddhists don't like the idea of skeletons because in China the body is sacred, and it came out with all these cultural ideas of why the difference is there. But
yeah, that's a great example.
I don't know if you saw that article, but it totally reminded me of what you were saying.
Very typical.
Maybe this may not be a proper question, but I wonder that how's a Farmville doing in China, that this is different type of the social interaction game, and it is so emerging in here at overall world, 80 million players are playing, and honestly speaking, the World of Warcraft it's very intuitive why people are so addicted to the game. But Farmville is very different. So I wonder if there is any study from the Warcraft, community that how different they are. Especially in China, there are big difference in audience or community.
Yeah, excuse me, I just have a similar question added to that, which is I want to know if you have any data on the just gender and age distribution within World of Warcraft between, the difference between North America versus China.
Do you know the answer to the Farmville question? Because
so Farmville, which runs on Facebook, is not in China because Facebook itself is banned in China. However, it's interesting because the first farm game that was played on a social network was actually developed in China, Happy Farm. And Farmville was seen by many as sort of a copy of Happy Farm that actually took off a lot bigger here in the US than Happy Farm is very popular in China. It runs on, I believe it runs on either Kaixin or Renren, one of their social networks. But it's an interesting challenge when you look at, so the fact that World of Warcraft needs to get approved by the Chinese government. But in the case of all the social games that run on Facebook, they just don't have access to the Chinese market because because the underlying platform is not allowed.
And then the question about age and gender in China. I don't have any hard quantitative data. I did some little surveys in the internet cafes, and here there's about 20% female players in World of Warcraft, and there seem to be about 10%. Just my little counts, and only in Beijing. Now, I have done a collaboration with some people at Park, and we have data from Taiwan and Hong Kong, which of course is not China, but at least it's Asia, so I might as well bring it up since we're there. And there the players tend to be younger, and there are fewer female players. So we do have those data, and we're just writing a paper about that now. And there are some interesting social implications just because you shift down a couple registers demographically in terms of age, you get some interesting different behaviors going on. So we're just working on that.
Yeah, one interesting point about the sort of the gender breakdown. I've always been curious because if you ever walk into a Chinese development studio or a Korean development studio, people that actually code and write the games, it's immediately noticeable how many more women work in the industry in China and Korea than in the US. If you walk into Blizzard or Infinity Ward makes Call of Duty, I would say probably there's less than 5% women. But if you walk into a Korean studio or a Chinese studio, you'll probably see closer to probably maybe 30 to 40% of the people that. And I've always wondered whether having that many more women making the games actually impacts the number of women that would play the games. I've never seen any numbers, but if you just walk into the companies and see who's making the games, it's immediately noticeable.
What about the gender of the characters people create in the game? Do we have any data on those?
I have a story about that.
Oh, yes?
Yeah, so here in North America, if you are a guy, it's perfectly fine to play a female character. And it's called gender bending, although it isn't gender bending. No one's pretending to be a female. They're just doing it because they like the way the characters look. I did a lot of interviews on this. And they do tend to choose the more attractive World of Warcraft characters. So I believe that when they tell me, yes, the Night Elf, exactly, right. They choose Night Elves. So that's true here. And I kind of just assumed that would be true in China. And I didn't even ask about it, but it came up in the interviews. This is the great thing about being an anthropologist, is that people tell you what they want you to know. So we started hearing this term ladyboy. And ladyboy, and the reason if you're a guy in China you don't play a female character is because you will be called a ladyboy. And it sort of seems to translate transvestite. I think there's some nuances that I wasn't completely getting, but it's not a nice thing to call someone. So we had several guys tell us, well, I really like the Night Elves, and I tried to play one, but I was called ladyboy so many times that I finally just gave up. And other people said, oh, I would never play a female character. That's not natural. And I wouldn't enjoy that. So that was kind of a cultural difference. And of course, the girls who are playing are sometimes called ladyboys, and they just shrug it off and they say, oh, I don't bother about those guys that call me ladyboy. So that's definitely a difference. And I think we tend to assume that the North American pattern of just, oh yes, it's fine to play a female character if you're a guy, is universal, but it is not universal.
Regarding to your question about how the Chinese studio have more females, I've been visiting many of the Chinese studios. I noticed that majority of the females are usually working for like content creation rather than technology. I think the one thing is the North American game studio is more tech heavy. Also, I think in the education in China, more female was pushed to study computer science by their parents. For example, if I go to a computer science school here in America, I think the female rate is actually lower than what it is in China, but I graduated from computer science in from Chinese education, and we have 30% female in my class, and most of them, I said, why do you guys study this? This is boring, right? But they were like, well, our parents said this is going to have a stable job. That's why they studied that. So I think that also contributes to the IT industry. Yeah.
Well, I have a question for Graham, but certainly you'd all have insights. You talked about the social aspect of it. Do you consider the new gaming industry to be a sort of an advancement of physical interaction, or do you see it as a degradation, or as something new altogether? Like, what is this doing to our social, physical, face-to-face world?
Definitely don't see it as a degradation. I think what we're seeing really is that it becomes all jumbled up. It's hard to describe just like an online social world and a kind of offline social world. And I said it especially in terms of CS. Normally they're mixed, and normally people who are playing are bringing a lot of people who they know in their real life into the games, and it's kind of adding. And I think there's been some good research on that about in World of Warcraft as well, about families playing together, spouses playing together, and so on. And it becomes even more blurry because a lot of the people that they do meet people online and start bonding with them, and then meet them in real life through various events or meetups, and then the line becomes tricky because they're not really anymore just your online friend, they're your real life friend, and then the networks get even more mixed up because then you add them to Facebook and then they're on your MSN along with your your spouse and your partner and teenagers. In particular, who play online games, and amazingly, teenagers still play Counter-Strike. I found out. They'll even add their CS friends to Facebook and put them as a sibling, which is quite popular these days. So the relationships are hard to categorize, really, although tempting to do so. So. They're really just quite expansive, and yeah, some of them last as long as some relationships. Yeah, 5 minutes of screaming at someone and calling them an a-hole and threatening them because you're really angry because you're playing a game, and some things develop into meeting your future wife. So not that happened to me. But.
Yeah, let me just comment on that. In the survey that I mentioned, we found, and this was in North America, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, we found that across those three regions, about 85% of people in World of Warcraft play with at least one person they know in real life. So, just to amplify his point.
Hi. I have a question. It was very interesting, the various gender issues that we discussed here. I'm curious to know, both locally or internationally, cross-culturally between the U.S. and the Far East, if you guys have made any observations about antisocial behavior in these worlds, whether MMORPGs or gaming. So activities that people are engaging in virtual space that are at the low level antisocial and might even progress into things that we traditionally would describe as criminal, like theft of virtual goods or attacking of characters or avatars or things like that against their will, use of malware in some of these games, anything like that. Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Go for it.
Antisocial behavior. Yeah, there's a lot of things on the surface that you can describe as antisocial behavior, and I'm not the expert on this. There's actually been some good work done on it, I believe, about trolling and other such behaviors in online communities. Again, it's hard to characterize, which is always the lame academic answer, I think.
Provide a little bit more background on this question. I mean, in a game like CS, where the goal is to kill each other, in theory that could be construed as antisocial behavior, except for the fact that it's a gaming environment. But are there things clearly there, from an anthropological perspective, there are things that are acceptable and things that aren't acceptable. Bonnie, you sort of talked a little bit about gold farming, or made an allusion to it earlier, and some people fairly have a problem with that. So are there things of that ilk and beyond that you guys view as sort of serious emerging issues that either could threaten some of the communities in online space or might even bleed out into real space?
I can comment on World of Warcraft in North America. I didn't get into enough depth in China to be able to comment there, but definitely here. So in WoW you have a lot of different chat channels. You have one that belongs to your guild, and in the guild it's pretty pro-social because you know people and you don't want to be a jerk or they'll kick you out of the guild. But then you have these public channels that are kind of just broadcast channels, and you see a lot of what I consider very antisocial behavior, i.e. racist and sexist talk. And you can report people, and sometimes the game masters will take action, especially on the racist comments. But it does concern me that I suspect these are like 12-year-old boys who are just, doing it because they can. But it does worry me that it is pretty much like, it's sort of accepted because you don't want to stop your game to try to chastise these kids who are out of line. And it sort of reinforces for them that there is at least this one context in which they can say some pretty nasty things. The battlegrounds, which is a kind of team-based activity where you're thrown together with teams kind of at random, you won't see these people again. Very bad behavior. People whine, they criticize other players, they leave when they shouldn't leave, leaving the team decimated. They do all kinds of things that are really, I think, pretty antisocial. So you see the bad stuff outside of the arenas in which you have the social controls of, for example, a guild.
I think it's hard. It's always been, the goal of some academics to show that bleed out into the real life, but it's always been really troublesome.
It's really hard to do that, yeah.
Yeah, to show that kind of causal connectivity between. So yeah, I mean there are for sure all sorts of things where if you connected to a CS server for the first time, you could see some pretty darn offensive language at least going on in there.
If I may, with a follow-up, have you guys in your own experiences come across any malware or anything that's affected the playing of the game with the communities, or Charles perhaps, have you seen some of this from an economic perspective?
Well, the one thing that interesting sort of, in terms of antisocial behavior within the games that like cheats, and so that's a consistent battle. The companies that make the games are usually against, and they're fighting ongoing wars with people that create ways to cheat their games. But also, I think amongst the player community, most of what I've seen is universally, they form sort of these moral judgments and are against and will out people that they believe are cheating, including in first-person shooter competitions. You have people who go back and review videos of contests, and they've tried to discover that, hey, so-and-so might have cheated in this competition. And so there seems to be sort of, both at grassroots and at the companies that create the games, a universal judgment in events like that, in terms of antisocial behavior within the games, that cheating in the games is against what the whole sort of ecosystem wants. In those instances, I've seen that. In other areas, it's much harder to find sort of a universal set of either morals or ethics. I will say, I think, a point to something that Bonnie had mentioned is it's always a challenge because a lot of these games, especially the really popular ones, are played by people of such big, age disparities and brackets. And it's always a challenge in terms of whether you're the government of China trying to monitor games, or your companies making the games that are monitoring them, or your communities, or there's groups that rate games for appropriate sort of age appropriateness. It's always a challenge because the games really do appeal to such broad ages. I mean, it's not normal in life for people in their, say, 50s to go and compete against people that are, 9 or 10 or 11 years old. But it happens in online games. And so a lot of the behaviors that come out of that, I think, are simply a function of all these people interacting in the same virtual world.
Oh, Genova, do you want to ask? Okay. I just have a question about materiality and the way we're defining it. So is there a way to extend it beyond software artifacts and hardware and platform to the environment itself and sort of questions around natural materiality? And your anecdote kind of brings that into focus because the earthquake sort of strikes from outside as sort of an externality to the system of cabling, right? And I'm just wondering if there's a way to incorporate this even into the economic models that Charles was talking about, or if it all sort of gets set aside as externality.
Defining materiality.
Oh, good. I'm going to leave that to him.
Oh, just leave it to the PhD students to define materiality. It's to a certain extent semantics, of course, like a lot of academia, in the sense that, especially in the discipline of anthropology, there's so much focus on these broad, very catch-all terms for a long time of culture. And we haven't actually, there's a big transition away from using these terms to characterize what's going on in human social relations. But we essentially are doing a lot of saying the same thing, but with a much more jargon-filled language, where we talk about, well, I don't want to use words that anybody uses in this panel. We call them jargon. So how do I explain this? Using the term materiality here to talk about this kind of layering of the coded and the infrastructural is just a way of kind of semantically distancing myself from a lot of the cultural research, which has its own huge volume of terminology and characterizations of human social life. And it's always been talked about in anthropology. We've always talked about the material world. It's a huge element of social scientific research, but it was almost always characterized in the sort of natural realm, because that's where at least anthropology as a discipline emerged out of, and cultural ecology was a huge part of the discipline. And people went very terribly slow to grab onto material technology in terms of produced by humans, and then the way it comes back and feeds back into our social lives. And well, there's been some really important research by some social scientists, and Bruno Latour and others, on this. But for now, the way I'm using this term is as a kind of third, not a third point between the cultural and the environmental and then the material, but it's again this just intersecting layers. But that's one of the problems with social sciences. You can easily spend 10 years on a PhD and lose track. So it's really important to kind of, for me at least, to segment off to a certain extent. I think if you can focus on one clear-cut materiality, we'll say submarine cables, you can use that to tease out all the other things instead of trying to throw it into this really complicated web of other terminology and ways of looking at social life. So.
Yeah, there's pretty much no agreement on what the term even means. I mean, some people use it in the sense of whatever is important, material in kind of the legal sense, and then some people use it to mean cables, and then I use it to mean designed artifacts, and so we're just kind of working our way through what we might even mean by that term.
Well, one funny thing about sort of your point of question of environmental externalities is, for instance, at Blizzard, there was a room which is kind of like a control room where they have a map of the world with servers lit up, and they're monitoring that, including television monitors on the side that show sort of cable channels from around the world, and they're monitoring the cable. So they're monitoring the networks and they're monitoring weather around the world, just in case they see a pattern which might cause one of their servers to go down. And they do this 24/7. That's like an office, they say there's always somebody there in the room monitoring. weather patterns and server traffic. And they also, besides environmental, they also monitor these online game companies. They have to be aware of schedules. So when there's vacations from school, they know they will see spikes in activity. When there's Chinese New Year vacations, they know they see spikes in activity. And they have to plan around those things. And so there's a lot of sort of externalities from real life events that do impact the games.
Andrew?
I read recently that Vietnam banned online games after 10 p.m. and I was wondering if you have any ideas on where the threat of online gaming originates from, maybe a counterproductivity or something, and what effects do you think that has on the social topography of places where these games are so highly regulated?
Well, I don't know much about the specific case of Vietnam, obviously, but video games, like kind of all other media before, are very easy targets for kind of not just government worry, but social worry, obviously. And there's been some really good research on this by Dimitri Williams. I think he wrote a kind of history of, I think the beginning of his PhD or his book is a history of the ways in which social concerns have centered around media, and you can go back literally to the telegraph and social political concerns about the telegraph, and about the potential subversive effects of being able to telegraph messages to people, on a woman telegraphing a message to a man in some other city. So in a sense, it's very familiar what's going on, and I think it's a kind of to a large extent, it's a knee-jerk reaction. And I'm sure there's also cultural factors in Vietnam. What you also find out about these, in terms of China at least, from what I know, what you also find out about these government interventions is that they often work terribly. They often work very poorly, and they're policed very, very poorly, in the sense that the police aren't very interested in spending all of their time enforcing these sorts of regulations, unless they're hard-coded into gameplay, which can have a much stronger effect. But people are very resourceful in getting around these issues. So yeah, it might be a black hole for a while on that kind of map of play, but I suspect as the knee-jerk kind of fades away and people get around it, things normally open up again. So.
Early on, I think some speakers mentioned some case where, even though mostly our talk is about games in different cultures and the difference and the similarity about them, I'm really curious about those cases where people from different culture actually interact in work environment. For example, a lot of Chinese farmers are in the United States server. Also, a lot of Counter-Strike games could happen between Canada and America, or happen between Europe and America. And I'm wondering, what is the trends that international, intercultural gameplay happening on is like? Are they more about conflict, or are they more about affinity?
I think it depends where you're looking. So, for example, in Europe, there's a lot of guilds that are across countries, even from northern to southern Europe. And because the time zones are, kind of okay for that kind of thing, it works pretty well. And I guess English is sort of the lingua franca, but you get people from all over the place playing together, which I think is really nice. In my research, I've met a lot of people from Canada, even from French-speaking Canada. As well as people from Alabama, who, when you hear them on Ventrilo on the voice chat, man, they sound really foreign. They're really, really different. Yeah. So you get all these different kinds of people coming together, but the time zones are a real killer. It's really, really hard for people to play across the time zones. And the gold farmers, a lot of the gold farming is done with bots now, but the gold farmers are, of course, not treated very well. You can, often tell if somebody's doing something really repetitive and they don't seem to speak much English. that it might be a gold farmer, and they're treated very badly, and Lisa Nakamura has done really excellent work on all of that. But I do think there is potential for people to learn foreign languages, learn foreign cultures, come together, probably in fairly regulated ways, at least for younger people, to try to get them to behave in the pro-social ways. But there's a lot of great stuff that I think can happen around these kinds of games.
And in terms of CS, the time zones is really important, and it's something you don't think about normally, because even if you have a kind of homogeneous language, in terms of Canada and North America, what happens is it tends to get split actually into 3 strips. So those maps actually, if you were to map out a lot of servers, you'd see this it's almost horizontal, very much moves, vertical, very much moves, very little moves horizontally across the map. And most people end up playing in east, west, or central. And that's how CS gets divided up in terms of, when you're going out and looking to play other people and you go on IRC, you go east, west, central. That's the first thing you have to tell them. And then, 5v5, whatever, so on. So time zones are incredibly important, of course, because the daily norms of people's lives regulate when they play to a large extent.
And the latency, is that a factor?
And the latency, of course. It's this combination in the sense that, you're not going to play on California servers from Toronto regardless, unless you have a reason to, and some people do, but very few. And then the time zones become really troublesome, especially if you're coordinating, if you want to coordinate team play and stuff like that. So.
What about, those Counter-Strike and World of Warcraft are synchronous games. What about asynchronous games? Is time zone still a matter?
So online games where?
Such as Farmville, those games, they don't require real-time interaction, but you can still interact with players. In those games, are time zones still a factor?
I've never played Farmville.
Yeah, they shouldn't be, but I don't know empirically how that's working out. It's a good question.
I think we have time for just one more question from Andrew.
I had 2, but I'll take that one.
We can ask 2.
This relates to the underwater submarine cables, and it's a question that comes out of sheer ignorance on my part. I do know a little bit about the early history of the telegraph, which just came up. It had a lot to do with the history of certain British and U.S. corporations stringing cable underneath the Atlantic and creating us the first links across the Atlantic. So I'm actually curious who operates Flag, who owns Flag, who plans these kind of cables, and how it is that there's only one submarine cable that goes to China and it's routed through the ocean near Taiwan. I'm just curious about how that works in terms of the topography of the infrastructure of the internet, primarily and gaming secondarily.
In terms of Flag, I don't know the name of the company that I think it was a major multinational investment. These cables do cost quite a significant amount of money to lay down, and they're major operations. They said you have to, building the cables is a ridiculous amount of work, and then of course you have to do the sonar mapping and everything, and you have to get agreements, especially if you're going very close to coastal waters that are owned by, staked by certain countries. They're major investments, and then they're just rented out. They land, they literally come up and they land at a certain place, and they come out of the ocean and then they get surrounded with metal to protect them further as they go on the beach, and then they go underground. They're literally rented out to bidders. There's a lot of these cables, and they're being laid more and more and more, obviously, because the capacity just still isn't there for the demand. And then once they're on land, they intersect with land-based cabling, and they go from there. So, major operations and billions of dollars, but still cheaper really than sending a satellite up that couldn't do anything close to the same amount of capacity. And it's actually really funny. I was looking up the Flag cable the other day, and they were saying another section of it, because there's many Flag cables. This investment group or this organization that lays them in Vietnam. They'd actually just one day they were monitoring it, and Vietnam went blank. A section of Vietnam went blank, and they're like, "What had happened?" And sea pirates had had dragged up the cable for the metal and the copper and had hauled it up, like slowly but surely, and like loaded it all onto their boat and then cut it, and then they tried to like bugger off and sell it somewhere. But apparently it was very difficult to sell, 250 kilometers of cabling on the open market. So they found it in some guy's warehouse, and he got in a lot of trouble, to say the least. So.
All right. I know the presentations have been most stimulating and there are lots of questions unanswered. Feel free to continue the conversation during break, which we're going to take from now till 4 o'clock.